Hello and welcome to the Global Innovators in Business series. In this series, we talk to leaders and innovators of different fields to share advice and experiences to young professionals seeking to drive impact in their careers. Chen Yu, or Yu Chen, is the president and co-founder of YeePay, a leading one-stop e-payment service provider in China. Think of your payment solution like WeChat Pay, Alipay, or Venmo, Zelle, but make the target customer corporations. So in China, when you book an airline ticket, one in two transactions would likely be processed by ePay. Additionally, Chin served as an advisor to a 10-part feature documentary, The Internet Age, in which he interviewed tech leaders like Elon Musk, Mark Zuckerberg, Peter Thiel, Reid Hoffman, Jerry Yang, and through all the conversations, Chin was able to write a book, Into the Future, Internet Makes in Their World. In Chinese, it's called 看见未来,改变互联网世界的人们. Before founding ePay, Chin held positions at Oracle, Deere Health Care, and AT&T Bell Labs. Thank you so much for joining.
Thank you for having me here.
So I think we ended in you worked at Oracle, Deere Health Care, and AT&T Bell Labs. What led you to go back to China in the early 2000s to build a company?
It was actually back in 2003. So at the time, I worked at Oracle I moved back to China in 2004. We founded the company in 2003 with my other co-founder, Bin. He's actually the protagonist, the real hero behind ePay. So when I left Oracle for China, I've already worked there for 7 years. So literally, I felt a 7-year itch, right? And at the time, China was actually a very happening place. It's a very exciting place. A lot of things are happening. It's actually one of the fastest growing economy, also one of the fastest growing in the mobile market, as well as the technologies, right? So we realized there are so many things could be done in China, right? So it's definitely a playground for entrepreneurs. That's when I decided to go back to China and join my co-founder at ePay.
So interesting. I moved to China. So I lived in Beijing from 2003 to 2013,
Wow.
just at the
We
same
have some
time.
overlaps.
I remember at that time was like, I think SARS was around that period. It's,
Exactly.
everything was happening at the same time. And like the street in front of, I lived in Yoibingguan at the time, and like the street outside of my door, like turned from like dirt roads to like high-rise buildings at the end of the 2013. So in the
Right.
midst of this, what was like building a company like, and how did you get buy-in from regulatory sides, from people? Did people even know what building a company like really meant?
You were exactly right when you mentioned SARS, because we always tell people this joke that we run the company from SARS to COVID, because ePay was actually established in 2003. So we have been around for 22 years. We literally started the company amid SARS, right? And during that period of time, people, because of the lockdowns, people had to stay at home. So there was actually a burgeoning market for online gaming
Mm.
and e-commerce because they couldn't leave their home. They have to do everything in front of their computers, right? But payment was actually a big issue, right? I met my co-founder Bin in Hawaii at a conference, at the tech conference. So we had chemistry instantly, right? We decided to do something. And after the conference, my partner Bin led a delegation back to China.
Mm.
And one thing he realized was that payment was really inconvenient. He literally had to stay in a hotel room in order to purchase an airline tickets. Because at the time, the only way you could pay for an airline tickets was really using cash, right? So he had to wait in his room for some delivery guy to send him the paper tickets, and
Mm.
then he could pay him in cash. The other thing is that he found out he had to pay for his phone bills, his mobile phone bills, by buying prepaid card in the streets from the street vendors or from convenience stores, right? So payment was literally one of the biggest unmet demands in the Chinese market. Was actually the foundation to everything else, like I mentioned earlier, for online gaming, for e-commerce, online shopping, everything needed payment. But that critical link was missing, right? So that's when he decided to start something around payment, and I decided to join him back in 2003. And he moved back to China first,
Mm.
actually during the lockdown of SARS. And then I joined him in 2004. Yeah. And just as you asked, back then, the whole infrastructure for running startups was basically not there. If you look at the VC, the venture capital environment and everything else was not in place. So
Mm.
it was actually much more difficult to start up a company back then compared to, let's say, 5 or 10 years ago. Yeah.
Yeah. So how did he do it?
Since we both worked in Silicon Valley, so we actually talked to potential investors from the Bay Area, from Silicon Valley first. And then I think the first institutional investor we were able to secure was actually an incubation fund backed by IBM. So initially we used IBM system for everything, the database, the app server, basically we run everything on the IBM tech stack. Yeah.
Wow.
And IBM even actually they did some PR for us, the free ride, right, from IBM. Yeah.
Wow. It was actually because there was so little infrastructure. So the infrastructure
Yeah.
that was there was actually US or like foreign based, but they saw an opportunity as well in this Chinese market where it was almost an open space for payment.
Yeah, that was actually the time a lot of the VC funds in China were set up. Many of them actually had US backing, US backgrounds, right? If you remember back in 2003, 2005, yeah, there are a lot of VC funds being set up during that period of time. Yeah.
I was about four. I wasn't paying attention as much at that time,
Yeah.
but no.
Like Sequoia China, a lot of those VC funds, they were all set up around 2005, 2006. Yeah.
Well, interesting. Huh. Yeah. And I think one really interesting difference between Chinese and US kind of culture, and I was talking to different friends about this, is in the US, there's this mindset that in whatever situation you're in, whatever kind of like difficulty you're in, you can use hard work, determination, and intelligence, and then pull yourself from your bootstraps and then succeed and build something. In China, I feel like this is a little bit less the case. There's a little bit more of a darker cloud around like you can do anything. There's like when you think of
Hmm.
this, you think of like the walls that you have to face, and then you think of the barriers like social capital or like physical capital or things that kind of like hinder like that's potential. Where at least in my personal mindset, it's just run towards a wall, hit it, and then realize, okay, I have to figure out how to get over it. When you were building this, did you know it will work, or were you ever afraid of actually this might just be a failure? I'm quitting my job at Oracle to do this.
I think at the time when we started the company, we were naive enough not to realize all the difficulties, right? Otherwise, we wouldn't have started, right? Just like you said, in China, there are actually a lot of the socio-cultural barriers, right? If you look at the regulatory environment, the market settings, and people are all talking about that you need the right guanxi relationships and connections to do anything. But overall, I think in China, people also have very strong entrepreneurship, right? People actually respect entrepreneurs and they work very hard. They think they can achieve something by making an effort. I think that's very similar to Silicon Valley and to the US. So in a way, there are cultural differences because of the geographies. But I also think we live in an age that the generational differences are more important. If you look at the world today, people the same generation, if you look at the Gen Z, they're pretty much following the same trends everywhere in the world, right? So there are cultural differences, there are geopolitical differences, but at the same time, there are also the same macro trends that are universal, both in China and the US. Yeah.
Hmm. And at the time, you saw that
Mhm.
like gaming and these areas where transaction was necessary didn't have a payment solution. And a few years down the line, I think a lot of these, actually, maybe not a few years, maybe like how long was it before this truly caught on and started everybody in China started using digital payments? And how were you in the middle of that as like an early leader of this, but seeing like everyone else adopt it? Was that a competition, or did you feel like this was just a trend that eventually caught on and you were ahead of the curve?
I think if you look at the long-term trend is that every sector, every industry is going digital, right?
Mhm.
Not only in their daily business in every aspect of their business processes, but also when it comes to payments and their fund flows, right? For some of the verticals, it might be relatively easier because they're already digitalized to a certain extent. But for some of the other more traditional sectors, it takes longer. So just taking airlines as an example, right? When we first went back to China, every single airline was still running using paper tickets, right? But I remember, so it makes sense. It made sense for people to use cash on delivery
Mm,
buying airline tickets, right? Because there's always a delivery guy who actually sends you the paper tickets, right? So at the same time, he could collect the cash, payment in cash, right? But I remember starting in 2006, 2007, there's this mandate from IATA, from International Airlines Association, that all the airlines and travel agencies have to adopt e-tickets, right?
mm,
So it didn't make any sense anymore if you still rely on cash on delivery. So there was a strive for electronic payments adoption, right? And on the other hand, the adoption of e-payment will actually accelerate the digital transformation, the adoption of e-tickets in turn, right? So it actually worked both ways, right? So
mm,
there are a lot of the verticals, a lot of industries, just like the airlines, going through that kind of digital transformation, which requires the digital payment, the e-payment as a foundation to facilitate their payment collections and everything, right? So that's why we say that payment is really the universal foundation for any business. It doesn't matter what kind of transaction you're doing, what kind of products and services you're going to sell. You have to use payment at some point in your transaction cycle, right? So
mm.
that's why payment actually has this last mile strategic position, right? It actually closes the loop of your transaction cycle, right? So it's a very mission critical piece of the infrastructure for any business. Yeah.
So interesting. And when companies like Alipay, WeChat Pay, and kind of like on the consumer side, how like what did your company face? Or like what's a big transition that your company had to face over the past decade or 2 decades as you're trying to build this product up and being like one of the earliest adopters, but seeing the market change and you have to adapt as well.
That's a great question because the first question we had asked a lot is what is your difference between ePay and
Mhm.
Alipay and WeChat, right? So we always have to explain to people that we're different from Alipay and WeChat because everyone outside of China knows about Alipay and WeChat. So when people talk about payment in China, they always think about Alipay and WeChat, right? So the answer we have is that Alipay and WeChat, they're more focused on the front end. They're more consumer facing by providing the digital wallet, right? But for ePay, our focus is really more on the back end.
Mhm.
We provide enterprise payment solutions for the enterprise customers, right? And also we cover a lot of different verticals, a lot of different industries.
Mhm.
So we don't compete with Alipay and WeChat. We actually partner with them. We aggregate all the different payment rails in the front end, including Alipay, WeChat, and also Apple Pay, and also other different types of payment methods, right? But our strength is really on the back end. We can actually provide customized payment solutions for various industries, ranging from retail, e-commerce, airlines and travel, tourism, financial services, government services, education, and also like cross-border international payments, right? And of course, when we first started company, we wanted to do something on the consumer side as well. But then we realized we couldn't really compete with Alipay and WeChat because Tencent has had the whole ecosystem, same with Alibaba, right? Alipay was successful not because of payment, it was because of Taobao, right? Because it could tap into all the resources and all the requirements of Taobao. But we don't have something like that, right? And then I think the most important strategic decision we made is really to pivot from the consumer side to the enterprise side. So by doing that, we turn our competitors into our partners, right? So we don't compete with Alipay and WeChat now. We actually partner with them. We can help them integrate into the back end business processes of all the different enterprises. And we pioneered this industry-focused model, payment model in China. So
Mhm.
I think this is really important for us from very early on. Yeah.
Yeah. So interesting. I think yeah, in the midst of a super competitive market and understanding like your placement in it is a really interesting position for a company to be in. And yeah, I can see how the world can have two different like types of companies that both succeed, like one on the back end, one on the front end, and both
Yeah,
can.
let me try to explain a little bit more why this is important, right? So
Yeah.
imagine if you're an airline, you can choose to work with Alipay directly, but then half of the other users, another 50%, well, maybe more, are using WeChat, right? So your finance department has to maintain two separate books, right? It's a mess, right? It's a nightmare, right? But by working through us, we can basically integrate both payment rails into one single payment solution. So you only need to reconcile one book, right? And it's not only just Alipay and WeChat. There are actually a lot of other payment channels. A lot of people still choose to use traditional, conventional credit cards.
Yeah.
And a lot of people actually paying through like a call center, an IVR system, right? So we
Mm,
need to be able to aggregate all these different payment channels, right? And on the other hand, is for a lot of the industry, for a lot of the verticals, the payment flow is actually very complicated. And
mm,
still taking airlines as an example, if you look at the whole ecosystem, the whole value chain, right? You have the airlines and in front of the airlines, you have the wholesalers like the travel agencies, right? And in front of the travel agencies, you have the retailers like the OTAs, online travel agencies like Trip.com or Expedia, right?
mm,
And then you have the end users, right? So imagine the whole payment flow. There are different segments. So most of the companies, most of the payment institutions, they only focus on one segment, one leg of the payment flow, right? We're
mm,
pretty much the only payment service provider in China that can process payment from end to give you a holistic view of the entire payment process. Now imagine if an end user wants to do some cancellation or change of the tickets, it's going to be a nightmare, right? You have the money has to go, if there's a cancellation, the money has to go back from all the way from the end users to the OTA, to the travel agency, and all the way back to the airlines. And if it's a cross-border payments, there's also FX involved, right? So typically it's going to be a nightmare. It's a total mess, right? But we can actually streamline the whole process to facilitate the end-to-end payment flow. We can provide the kind of the one-stop total solution that link all the different parties in the ecosystem, right? That's really the value proposition we have. So from the consumer's perspective, most people only see payment as moving money from account A to account B, but in reality, it's actually much more complicated than that.
yeah. That actually brings me to a really a question that I was going to mention to you too, is I know one of the big goals that ePay has been pushing over the past few years is internationalization. So like being able to do cross-border transactions. And it seems like a really tough task with like geopolitical, like regulatory differences, with FX. What is the stickiest problem to solve in that space?
That's a great question because internationalization is indeed one of our top priorities. But it's also, as you mentioned, where the payment industry encounters some of the toughest challenges because you have I think the first hurdle is that if you look at foreign exchange, both the shortage of the FX liquidity in certain emerging markets and the volatility of exchange rates globally, right? So this creates a lot of uncertainty and costs for businesses and consumers alike, right? So there's actually a huge market gap. If you look at the payment in different local markets, most of the local markets have basically resolved the consumer payments, the issue of consumer payments. In China, you have Alipay and WeChat. In the US, you have the Apple Pay and the Google Pay. Everything is very convenient. But when it comes to the international payments, it's still chaotic and messy. You have a lot of incompatible and archaic payment rails, right? We should be able to think about it. We should be able to move money around the world, just like moving a piece of information and data on the internet, right? But that's not the reality. There are a lot of barriers, a lot of hurdles because of the regulatory fragmentation and because of the volatility of exchange rates and also shortage of FX liquidity in a lot of different markets, right? So that's the problem we're trying to solve. And also after COVID, a lot of the Chinese enterprises are trying to grow their business overseas outside of China, and the markets are reopening. So at the same time, there are also a lot of international businesses trying to tap into China, right? So it works both ways, inbound and outbound traffic. So we need to build an infrastructure that can facilitate this kind of cross-border payments and settlements, make everything more efficient, and we can move the fund more easily, right? So that's the goal we're trying to achieve when it comes to internationalization. Yeah.
Yeah. And yeah, I think what you're saying in like liquidity of foreign capital and like being able to like have the right Zimbabwe dollars to yes,
Exactly.
it's
Yeah.
not the easiest task unless you have
Yeah,
like
and there's also the problem with the banking connectivity, interoperability. Banks in different countries, they have different standards. There are a lot of barriers and hurdles when it comes to cross-border payments. Yeah.
and the other really interesting space I think bring this to the present day is ePay represents like the foundational transaction like payment system that like the Web 2 kind of like basis represents. And right now there's a lot of conversation, a lot of talk about Web3, and there's a lot of investments, more and more institutional capital, more and more valuation is kind of put into Bitcoin, Ethereum, and these like Web3 versions where you own what you're kind of paying or what you have a digital ownership. Is this hype from your perspective as a Web 2 kind of developer, or is this something that you think will be really important and you want to be a part of that too?
It's not a hype. It's a very sensitive question because cryptos are strictly banned in China, right? But what I can tell you is that we flirted with Web3 a long time ago, more than 10 years ago, back in 2013, when the first top three crypto exchanges came out in China. Back then, there was Bitcoin China, Huobi, and what's the other one? OKX, right? OKCoin, right? So when they first came out back in 2013, they all used our payment service, right? At that time, you could still directly buy BTC, Bitcoin, using RMB, using fiat, right? So we provide the payment services to all top three crypto exchanges. But
Mm,
within a year, the central bank, the People's Bank of China, came out with a mandate that prohibited any payment institutions and commercial banks
mm,
from providing services to those crypto exchanges. So
mhm,
we shut down our service because we were a license holder. We needed to be regulatory compliant, right? But we've been paying attention to the crypto and the Web3 trends all along. I know there are a lot of the discussions around stable coins and Web3 these days, and definitely that's one part of the solutions to the cross-border problem, right? Because stable coins can be used as an intermediary media to facilitate more efficient cross-border transactions. And again, as I mentioned, because cryptos are strictly banned in China, so we could not be directly involved in providing the Web3 based solutions, but we've incubated projects outside of China. There's this project called Kun, KUN, which is a company based in Hong Kong, and they are a direct partner with YeePay. Basically, the solution they provide is using stable coins to facilitate cross-border, exactly to use stable coins to facilitate cross-border payments and transactions. Because one of the rising trends today is that more and more businesses are starting to use stable coins for
mm,
cross-border payments and settlements. And a lot of these businesses are coming from traditional sectors. They're forced into using Web3 because they didn't want anything to do with cryptos, right? Think about private key management and everything, right? It's a nightmare for them. The conventional Web3 world was the conventional Web3 world is very unfriendly to these people, right? They have to use Web3 because their customers, their partners, even their competitors up and down the value chains are beginning to use stable coins, right? So they have no choice. They have to use stable coins and Web3 based solutions for cross-border payments, right?
yeah.
So this actually presents a huge market gap because, like I mentioned, the conventional Web3 is very unfriendly to these people from the traditional world, right? So that's exactly the problem Kun is trying to address by bridging Web2 and Web3, using the Web3 infrastructure
Mm,
to solve the problems from those Web2 applications and Web2 businesses, right?
mm,
So I think there's a huge market opportunity for that, right? I don't think it's gonna 100%, it's gonna completely replace the Web2 infrastructure we have in the near future, but it's gonna be a good complement to the existing infrastructure we have today. Yeah.
nice. Love to talk to Quinn at some point and understand that part of the business, that part of the technology and innovation as well. Yeah. So many other questions. Did you have anything you wanted to add?
Yes, it's such a great opportunity to listen Chen answer like the question that Chris asked. And I actually saw in the recent report that you said it's hard to predict the future. So why not go ahead and create it? And with that in mind, looking 5 years ahead, where do you see the most exciting opportunities for AI in payments, whether it's reshaping the risk control or reimagining the user experience or even redefining the entire payment ecosystem? And if YeePay could redefine one thing about payments through AI, what would you want it to be?
Mhm. That's a great question. But first of all, that's not my line. It's Alan Key. The best way to predict the future is to create it, right? But again, it's hard to predict the future. But I think definitely with AI, there's limitless opportunity, possibilities, right? There are a lot of AI is changing every industry, not just payment, not just financial services, but all across the board. And today, when we're talking about the forefront of technologies, we always mention AI and Web3. Because if you think about it, AI really revolutionizes the productivity, right? Really revolutionizes what we call the forces of production, right? Basically, the way we create values. On the other hand, Web3 really transforms the relations of production, right? The way the value is shared, owned, and distributed and governed, right? So these two technologies actually come together, right? So one vision that the payment industry really has for the future, combining the trends of AI and Web3, is that if you think about it, in the future, maybe 90% of the wealth is going to be created by AI agents, right? This is what we call the agentic economy, right? And maybe more than 90% of the transactions, payment transactions, are going to be done between agents. It's going to be agents to agents, not between human beings, right? And it's not going to be, and all these transactions are not going to be based on the existing financial infrastructure we have today, right? Because you cannot imagine that every one of these agents has a bank account, right? So the entire financial infrastructure, the payment infrastructure, basically needs an overhaul, right? We need to reimagine, restructure, and rebuild the entire infrastructure for future payments, for the agentic economy, for the transactions and wealth creation by AI and AI agents. So that presents a huge opportunity for the payment market, right? So this is basically what we see in the future, 5 or 10 years from now, right? And of course, there's going to be a lot of other applications of AI in the payment industry, because if they think about it, AI thrives on data. So payment and financial services are actually the best playground for AI. We're actually one of the earliest adopters of AI technology because we generate the massive amount of transaction data, right? We already been using AI for more than 10 years when it comes to risk management, fraud detection, and anti-money laundering. So people have been using AI in the payment industry for a long time. It's well before the revolution of generative AI brought upon by ChatGPT, right? So in the future, you can imagine there's going to be more applications of AI in payment and financial services, right? There's one saying in our industry that the best payment is to make payment disappear, right? Because if you think about it, people don't use payment for the sake of payment. Payment is really a means to an end. People want to use payment because they want to purchase something, right? So the less painful, the more invisible payment becomes, the better, right? So the goal is really to eliminate the payment process completely to make it invisible, right? How do you achieve that? You can use AI, right? So for example, if you walk into the store, there's no visible payment process. You can just pick any items from the shelves and just walk out. A smart store should be able to detect who you are just by the biometrics, right? So that's the possibilities AI can achieve in the future. And it's not only on the consumer side, but also on the business side, right? AI can make, we can, and along with Web3, along with blockchain technology, we can make money programmable. We can actually make smart payment transactions, and we can actually make smart money. We can make everything programmable, right? Everything can be done through a smart contract, right? So if you think about the combination of AI and Web3 technologies in the future, right, the possibilities are limitless. Yeah.
Wow. Thank you for the answer. I can already imagine with the AI agent that
Mhm.
how it's gonna change people pay for everything. And I know ePay already actually worked on the back end of the payment system. So people won't actually notice who they are going to pick to. If they book a trip in trip.com or Expedia, they will only know they pay through chat or Alipay. And yeah, they won't can tell YeePay is actually working on the back end to process it to the business. And how would you think the AI agent will also change this part in terms of YeePay, the role that YeePay is playing in the payment system?
Because we focus on the back end, we focus on providing enterprise solutions for a lot of the businesses in various industries, right? So in the future, a lot of the B2B processes are going to be done through AI agents, right? So we need to find a way to integrate better payment solutions into the agentic economy, right? By seamlessly integrating payment solutions with all the AI agents-driven business processes, right? So that's the way to go in the future. Yeah.
That's even more streamlined, for the
Mhm.
payment system with the help of AI agent. I have another question, but not sure if we have enough time to ask.
I think we have enough time. We have more than enough time. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Having both Silicon Valley and local China industry experience, and also someone who has the international background, how have this changed shaped your vision and approach to innovation at YeePay?
I worked in Silicon Valley for 7 years, and I learned a lot of things from the industries, from people around me. So definitely, this actually helped me a lot when I came back to China and started YeePay, right? But at the same time, there are also a lot of things I could learn from China, right? Because it's one of the fastest growing economy, and it's one of the most fascinating cultures, right? So I think living in the world today, you need to be really open, right? You need to have an open mind to be able to learn from different cultures and people from different backgrounds. Not restrict yourself just to one area, right? But you need to open you up to different possibilities. I think that's the key thing for the young, especially for the younger generation. Definitely that benefited me a lot. So I would imagine it's also going to be a good thing to follow for the younger people. Yeah.
That's such great advice for people like to open to more culture-wise and to more opportunities. And I know going global or true high has become a hot trend right now. And what advice would you give to young professional or young entrepreneurs, especially those aiming to enter the fintech area and expand internationally from China?
I didn't get the first part. Going what? I'm
Going
sorry.
global or true
Oh,
high?
going global. I'm sorry. Going
Yes.
global. I thought you were I thought you were talking in Chinese. Going global, right?
Yeah.
I think globalization, the overall trend of globalization is slowing down a little bit. And in a way, we're living in a more divided world, right? But I think if you look at the longer term, I think the trend of globalization is irreversible, right? So again, going back to my early comment, you still need to keep an open mind, right? There's still a lot of opportunities. And although now, when we see the rising geopolitical tensions, the tariff wars, the decoupling trends, right? There are a lot of you see a lot of negative news, right? So this definitely presents a lot of challenges for businesses, right? But at the same time, because of the geopolitical tensions, because of the tariff wars, the global trade networks, the supply chains are being restructured, realigned. So it also presents a lot of opportunities, right? So this is basically what we're going after, right? So in any kind of situations, there are always challenges, but there are also always opportunities, right? So I think right now it's still you still need to keep a global mind, to keep open and try opportunities, especially talking from China, especially after COVID. I know a lot of the Chinese enterprises are trying to expand their overseas footprint. They're trying to grow their business outside of China. This is like a macro trend for a lot of the businesses, a lot of the companies in China. At the same time, I also know a lot of the international companies are trying to tap into the Chinese market, right? Definitely, I would say globalization is still there. So keep a longer term view and there will be opportunities.
Yeah. Yeah. Keep an open mind view and there will always
Mhm.
be opportunities. Thank you so much. That's all from my side. And thank you, Mr.
Thank
Yu,
you.
for sharing your insights. I'll head back to host.
Sounds good. Yeah. Zia is an expert in AI coding and has been doing a lot of work in this space. So I think those
That's
questions, I
great.
thought that she was the right person to ask. But I think it's super interesting as we've gone in this conversation. We've now entered AI, we've entered Web3, and we're seeing how those pieces will come critically in play when we look at blockchain tech, when we look at fintech and like the future of financial
Sure.
technology. And this actually reminds me, and a little bit of a shift in the conversation is that I know you had a series of interviews that you did with some of the leaders of the internet space and talking to people like Elon Musk, Mark Zuckerberg, and Jerry Yang, some of like the most well-known names that have built kind of like what we know now as the internet. And as we're entering this like new like era of Sam Altman, like these like new players that kind of is in the same space, I'm really curious to hear your learnings and advice from this first section of people who like built the internet economy. So first of all, tell us a little about how you wrote the book, how this came together, and and yeah, what did you take away from it?
Oh, that was actually my book was called Into the Future, right? In Chinese, right? But now the future has already become the past, right? Because te technology, if you look at the technology world, everything is fast moving. So there's this new wave technology. There's always the next big thing in technology, right? So we're talking about AI. 10 years ago, we were talking about the internet. I wrote a book because at the time I helped the China Central Television to work on the 10-piece documentary called Internet Age. And in that documentary, we interviewed a lot of the tech leaders, including Elon Musk, Mark Zuckerberg, and Jerry Yang, Reid Hoffman, right? Basically, all the names that you know from the Internet Age, right? So it's actually a good learning experience for me because I actually studied computer science back in college. Not only the tech leaders that we interviewed, I also interviewed a lot of people I used to read from my computer science textbooks. Usually, when you read something about someone in the textbook, you would imagine those people who made history were already dead, right? So you can imagine when I could have interviewed those people face to face, it was actually a quite exciting experience for me. Again, it's a great learning opportunity for myself because those names that I was familiar with when I was back in college, basically the person is sitting face to face in front of me, right? It's really a very exciting moment. So after having done that documentary with China Central Television, I decided to write a book to complete with that documentary, right? And when we first started, another thing I wanted to mention is that when we first started YeePay back in 2003, PayPal was actually an inspiration for us, right? It was one of the first major tech companies to go IPO after the dot-com bust in the early 2000s, right? And in Silicon Valley, you have this term called the PayPal mafia, right? So the people from PayPal, they literally shaped the whole tech landscape, right? They founded so many other different tech companies that transformed the entire tech industry. So definitely that's an inspiration for us. And if you think about it, payment is really the hardest thing, one of the hardest thing to do, right? Not only you have to deal with the banks, you also have to deal with the merchants, also with the consumers and the regulators. So you have to make all the pieces moving together to make it work, right? So anyone who has worked at the payment company pretty much knows how to do a startup, right? Because it's one of the greatest challenges. You have to make all these pieces to work together, right? So that's why there's PayPal Mafia in Silicon Valley. And then in China, we call ourselves the ePay Mafia, right? So that's definitely an inspiration for us. And you can imagine it was actually very exciting for me to actually meet a lot of people from the PayPal Mafia, right? Doing that documentary. So it's a great learning experience for me and definitely it's an inspiration. Yeah.
So such a unique and interesting opportunity. And I think it answers a similar question that this interview series tries to answer is what influenced them to drive impact, what influenced them to kind of pursue these things that seems impossible, seems very out of the ordinary, but they could do it. And what was the belief mindsets that they had to do it? What surprised you in these conversations?
I think everyone surprised me. Everything was exciting. I shouldn't say everything surprised me because I did a lot of homework before I did the interview, right? So it's a great learning experience. But what really made an impression on me is that all of these people actually have a long vision for the future, right? So most people think from the present into the future, but these people think backwards. They have a vision of the future first, and then that drives them to decide what to do today, right? So that thinking from the future is really what really inspires me. I think that's really what makes these people successful. Yeah.
Mm. This is something that I think a lot of
That's why we call the book Into the Future, right? Because these people, they see the future first, and then from there, they think backwards and decide what to do today to achieve that future. That's also why we always say the best way to predict the future is to create it, right? You have to turn future into a self-fulfilling prophecy, right?
It's so interesting. I think I love talking to you about this because I tried to write a book. I wrote a book on all the interviews that we've done with the Global Innovators in Business series. And two of the very interesting quotes that I remember, one was from Tim Draper, from Draper Ventures, very big VC who invests in eBay.
Yeah, he's actually an investor in us. Yeah,
That's too.
Tim
I think
Draper,
I
right,
thought so too, because I know
right.
Tang was a part of it. Yeah, so Tim Draper said it's one of the big things he looks for is what would this do in 20 years? What is the potential impact of this business or this product in 20 years, and then backtrack from that. And then the other person who we talked to is a founder called Keller Ronaldo, who does a company for drone delivery. And then it started off in Africa. It's called Zipline. And then it started in Africa in Rwanda and it delivers like blood supplies. But they've gradually like entered into the US and as like during COVID, they were like one of the big suppliers for delivering through drones. And one of the things that he said was his favorite thing to do is reading science fiction textbooks or science fiction books because through science fiction books you're kind of like seeing into the future,
Yeah.
reading like the three body problem. You can envision like what the 50, 100, 500 years later could look like. And a lot of those things came true in 10 years or 5 years. So it's that idea of like into the future and looking ahead is such an interesting perspective that especially from your conversations. What was Elon Musk? Yes.
At the time, I think he was those was like 10 years ago. He was actually very shy compared to what he is today. I think he was actually more shy than I expected. Yeah. I mean, I think he was it's a very short interview. During the interview, he was actually very humble, very straight to the
Um,
point.
uh, that's super cool. And Mark Zuckerberg. How about anything
Um, well,
surprising?
this is just a joke. Everyone thinks he acts a little bit like a robot. I think he is a little bit. Uh,
And did you
uh,
think that from talking to them, did you see from that at that time, I know it's just that one conversation, but do you see that what they're building now, kind of like inklings or hints of what they were thinking at the time that led to what they're trying to do, like with Meta, with going into the moon, like space travel?
I think for Elon Musk, you can see this continuation. I'm talking about the business alone, not on the politics side, right? On the political side, right? So if you look at the business that is involved in today, is pretty much the continuation of what he was trying to do 10 years ago, because he had a very clear long-term vision about what the future is about. He'd been talking about going to Mars like starting from 20 years ago. So definitely it's a continuation of what he's always been doing. It's a very clear vision, and I can see that's what drives him to do all of those things that he's doing now. Yeah.
And how did Chinese media, especially you're doing this for CCTV, like how did they react to kind of like this view of entrepreneurship, this view of internet? I think there's legends in China, Robin Lee, like what's what was the reaction to this type of US entrepreneur, like US like vision, and how did you see what was a very interesting observation that you've had of this launching in China?
Can you reframe your question a little bit? I'm trying to understand what the angle you're trying
No,
to get.
no, I'm just curious of how
Right.
this was taken in like China from and like the portrayal of like US entrepreneurship, the vision, and how it differed from like Chinese kind of background and culture, and like how this like influenced
I
China.
think people still have a very positive view of the entrepreneurship in the US because just like I said, a lot of the Chinese companies are inspired by their US counterparts, right? This was especially the case in the early days because we had this term called C2C, copy to China, right? For every US company, you have a Chinese equivalent, right? There's Google and then there's Baidu, right?
Yeah.
There's eBay, then there's Taobao, right? But nowadays, it's actually the landscape is changing because there are a lot of the original innovations coming from China, right? So
Mhm.
now we have this new term called KFC, copy from China, right? We know that Meta is actually copying from Tencent, from ByteDance, right? From Chinese companies as well,
Yeah.
right? So I think it works both ways, right? So in the early days, 20 years ago, when the first generation, I wouldn't say first generation of internet entrepreneurs in China, that goes back to the 90s, right? They all try to learn from the US, right? But nowadays, there are so many innovations coming from China. So I think the US could learn from China as well. Although we live in a more divided world, but I think if you think long term, if you think real long term, the trend of globalization is irreversible. So I think eventually everything still needs to open up. Yeah.
Can I ask a follow-up question? Yeah, because as someone who also comes from an engineering background, I studied electrical engineering at Huazhong University of Science and Technology for my
Oh, that's great.
undergrad. Yeah, and I'm very interested in
That's more
your career.
hardcore than what I studied. Uh,
I think back at the time of 90s, you study computer science. It is the would you think that is the most correct decision that you've made, like choosing your major or as computer science? And
Yeah, back in the 90s was actually computer science was not the top choice. If you look at
mm,
our department, we were all leftovers from physics and math departments. My first choice was actually physics, but I wasn't smart enough. My entrance exam score was not high enough for me to get enrolled into the physics department. So that's how I ended up in computer science. So our department computer science department is all leftovers from physics and math. Nowadays it's different, right? People are all trying to learn electric engineering and computer science, computer engineering. But back in the 90s, I think physics and math were still the top choices.
wow, that's very interesting to know. It's very different from right now. And
So I'm not the smartest student.
I'm also very interested in your career journey because from
Right.
Silicon Valley, I saw your experience went back to Jiangsu Bank, and also like from computer science, engineering into entrepreneurship. And I'm very curious, when did the idea of starting your own venture or starting your own company first take root? And was it during your time studying computer science in Peking University, or later during your 7 years working at Oracle? And at what point did you begin to develop this entrepreneurial mindset of
I think the Silicon Valley culture definitely helped. Although at the time I worked at the big corporation Oracle. I was actually I was actually at Oracle for 7 years, and like I said, I felt the 7 year itch. But living and working in Silicon Valley, there's no way you cannot there's no way that you did not get inspired by those startup stories, right? So that's what made me decide to join my partner, our CEO, Bin, at YeePay back in 2003, 2004. Yeah.
well, is that would you say back to 2003 and 2004, that's the first wave of Silicon Valley having the entrepreneurial, or everyone is considering to start
No,
their
I think
startup?
before that, even before the 2000, early 2000 dot-com bust, right? In the late
Mhm.
90s, there's always that's the first wave of the internet entrepreneurship, right? Remember back then there was a lot of companies like Infosec, Excite, right? All those companies already disappeared, but there were a lot of the startups back in the late 90s during the initial first wave of the internet boom. And then there's the dot-com bust, right? In the early 2000s. And after the 2000 dot-com bust, there's like the second wave, Web 2.0, right? Social media and everything. There's another wave of internet startups and entrepreneurships, and also had a huge influence in China, right? That's the time when you see a lot of the startups being set up in China as well, across the Pacific. Yeah.
mindset wise, when or which specific mindset that changed from when you're doing your time in Oracle? I know Silicon Valley might have the natural influence on your mindset of being entrepreneurship, but what specific mindset changed or swift as an individual contributor at Oracle, and then comparing to when you start your own of YeePay?
I think it's a gradual process, right? Because when I was working at Oracle, I worked on because everyone knows that Oracle is a database company, right? But in reality, actually, Oracle has a technology stack. Database is only at the bottom, right? And in the middle, we have what we call the middleware. That's the department that I was working at, right? The middleware application server, web server, which is much more related to the internet. Believe it or not, at the time, we even had the payment gateway product at Oracle. We had an e-commerce server at Oracle. That's the stuff that I was working on. So it's more internet related. And on the top, we have the ERP, CRM, the apps, right? So the work that I was doing at Oracle was actually more related to the internet. And I was a product marketing manager working at Oracle. I also worked with a lot of the external companies and partners. So that exposed me to a lot of these opportunities, which made me itchy, right? Trying to do something by myself. And then I decided to join my partner to start up this YeePay. Again, because at the time we realized that payment was actually one of the biggest unmet demands in the Chinese market. It was actually the foundation to every other business, right? Think about payment as an enabler, right? It's an enabler for a lot of other industries, a lot of other businesses, right? It's actually the foundation for doing any types of transaction. Yeah.
Wow. Things, yeah, like the years doing Oracle or Silicon Valley is give you the mindset of trying the entrepreneurship.
Yeah, at
Okay.
Oracle, there's also a department called Oracle Venture that I worked
Mm-hmm.
with. Oracle Venture invested in a lot of internet companies, including some of the well-known names like WebEx, for example. That's one of the portfolio companies when I was working with Oracle Venture. Yeah,
Thank you so much for the answer.
thank you.
No, I think that's a really good context for the start of that career and your journey. Yeah, I think as we're closing in, so throughout this interview, I think there's a few key points that I think we've talked through. One is keeping an open mind. The other is looking into the future and having like a long-term vision as one of the key things that so many of these internet entrepreneurs had. And the other area that I really wanted to drive home is kind of this idea of impact. How do you see the impact of ePay, and how do you see young professionals like thinking about what they want to kind of achieve in their life, what they want to do with their life? What is the impact they want to create? And what is your advice in that sense?
Something that I can share is that building ePay is exciting because it has an impact not only in the business world, but also on the society as a whole. Because payment is, like I said, is an enabler. It actually helps transform the digitalization of a lot of the traditional sectors. One thing we are very proud of at YeePay is that we were actually the company, the payment institution that facilitated the first ever online donation in China. This is actually on record, right? Back in 2004, we worked with the Red Cross in China to support the online donations for the Indian Ocean tsunami relief. This was well before Alipay and WeChat, right? So we were actually the first. We actually did the first online donation in China, and this was even before our first product came online. We actually used the beta version, the trial version of our service to support this online donation. I mentioned this because I want to give you an example of how payment can actually make an impact on the society as a whole, not only just to the business world, right? So it's actually an enabler. It actually transforms every aspect of our life because payment actually not only connects people to transactions. It actually connects people to possibilities because everything you do, like I said, you have to use payment at some point. Another thing I can share, I think for young professionals, is this is actually part of our corporate culture at YeePay, what we call the four courages, right? The courage to think, the courage to speak, the courage to act, and the courage to feel, right? The courage to think basically means that you want to challenge the assumptions because you want to see the bigger picture, right? If you don't, you need to think big, right? If you're not scared by your own dream, that means your dream is not big enough, right? And courage to speak means that you need to be open, be honest, have the courage to speak up and to build trust through dialogue, open dialogue.
Mm.
Courage to act basically means that you need to move fast, especially in the internet age, right? Because everything changes rapidly, right? You need to take responsibility and drive results, right? You need to have this execution, right? And the courage to fail means that you need to learn from your setbacks and grow stronger for the future, because we need to have a very tolerant culture for failures. And think about Elon Musk, right? He basically achieved success by blowing up rockets, right? This is what this is what we mean by have the courage to fail. When you have failed enough times, you will find success eventually.
Wow, that's such a good way to end this, is these 4 items. Yeah, and then being able to like think through, like even in the payment space, like how much impact it can create, even in early days. I didn't know that. That's so interesting to hear. And like what that has led to with this, like every donation now, most of the donations go through online. What a tide shift that has created from one company and from like one kind of like process improvement. Thank you so much for taking this time, Chen.
Thank you again. Thank you for having me here. Thank you.
Thank you.